On the 16th of May, 1806, the Royal Navy put up the most aggressive defensive wall in the history of competitive sailing. Ships from Brest to the Elbe. No gaps, no DRS zones, no getting through on the outside. Sports historians describe the British Naval Blockade of 1806 as the most dominant defensive package ever deployed in the history of maritime racing. The question nobody has thought to ask until right now is whether Max Verstappen could have broken through it. Quick context: after destroying the French fleet at Trafalgar in 1805, the Royal Navy had every European port locked down so hard it couldn't be overturned. Napoleon, who could no longer mount a direct invasion of Britain, responded in November 1806 with the Berlin Decree, forbidding all French allied territories from trading with Britain. His counter-blockade, the Continental System, was essentially Napoleon's attempt to do an undercut on the British economy, cut Britain off from European trade entirely and starve it out. The British responded with their own orders in council, blockaded the French coast right back, and shipped everything to South America and Asia instead. Napoleon's system ended up hurting his own allies more than Britain. The enforcement required monitoring thousands of miles of European coastline with customs officials who didn't want to be there. Classic case of defending too much ground with not enough grip. Here's the thing about the British Naval Blockade of 1806 that nobody mentions. Max Verstappen is Dutch. The Netherlands was one of Napoleon's primary puppet states and one of the first territories forced into the continental system. Dutch merchants were directly hammered by the blockade. The Dutch couldn't trade with Britain, couldn't trade freely at sea, and had their country formally annexed by France in 1810 when Napoleon decided they weren't enforcing the rules hard enough. In terms of pure racing lineage, Verstappen comes from a country that was on the wrong end of the most dominant defensive strategy in naval history. This is essentially his home circuit. The Royal Navy's blockade worked on one principle: control the gaps and nobody gets through. This is famously not a principle that has ever worked on Max Verstappen. At Monaco 2021, he made a move through a gap that was measured afterwards at approximately not wide enough. At Brazil 2016, he made 4 overtakes in conditions where normal drivers were filing track limits complaints. At Interlagos 2022, he passed Carlos Sainz in a spot the commentators were still processing 15 seconds later. The blockade had enforcement gaps: neutral ships, stretched patrol routes, smugglers running British goods through Portuguese and Spanish ports constantly. The continental system's actual problem was that you can't close every gap at once. Against a driver who has built an entire career on finding the one gap nobody else saw, this is not a blockade. This is a DRS zone with extra steps. The continental system officially collapsed in 1814 when Napoleon abdicated and the Berlin Decree was lifted. It failed because no matter how dominant your defensive package looks on paper, if someone is willing to go for a gap that isn't quite there yet, you will eventually lose track position. Max Verstappen has broken more dominant defensive lines than this on a Sunday afternoon. The British Naval Blockade of 1806 would have lasted approximately as long as Charles Leclerc's lead at Monaco. Drop a comment with your best F1 and history crossover idea, and I'll turn it into a video.